Why are there so few women philosophers? Power, history, and the architecture of silence. When people ask why there are so few women philosophers in the canon, the question is often framed incorrectly. It assumes absence, but the real issue is not absence, it is erasure. Women have always thought, they have always questioned. They have always produced ideas about truth, ethics, power, and existence. What they lacked was not intellect, but permission. Philosophy, from its institutional birth, was never a neutral space. It emerged inside structures of power, academies, monasteries, courts, and later universities. These spaces were not designed for women. They were designed to preserve authority, lineage, and legitimacy. Almost always male to enter philosophy. Historically, one needed leisure, education, and recognition. Leisure required freedom from domestic labor. Education required access to institutions. Recognition required participation in public intellectual life. Women were systematically denied all three. This is not a coincidence. It is architecture. Philosophy presents itself as universal reason, but it has always been embedded in social conditions. The great questions were asked by those who were allowed to speak publicly without punishment. For women, speaking publicly was often framed as impropriety, hysteria, or rebellion. When women did philosophize, they were rarely recognized as philosophers. They were labeled mystics, poets, moralists, wives, muses, or anomalies. Their work was read as personal expression, not abstract thought. Emotion disqualified them from universality. This double standard shaped the canon. The philosophical tradition claims to value reason over identity, yet it consistently treated women's ideas as inseparable from their gender. A man's thoughts were philosophy, a woman's thoughts were experience. Even when women wrote explicitly philosophical works, history filtered them out. Their texts were excluded from curricula and translated, unpublished, or attributed to male contemporaries. The canon did not merely forget women, it actively selected against them. There is also a deeper issue. Philosophy has often defined itself against what was culturally associated with women: reason versus emotion, mind versus body, public versus private, universality versus particularity. These binaries elevated masculine-coded traits while devaluing feminine-coded ones. As a result, women were excluded not only socially, but conceptually. This exclusion became self-reinforcing. Because women were absent from the canon, philosophy appeared masculine by nature. And because it appeared masculine, women were discouraged from entering it. Absence became justification. Modern institutions inherited this structure. Even as women gained formal access to education, philosophy departments remained gatekept by traditions that valued abstraction over lived reality, detachment over embodiment. Fields where women excelled: ethics of care, social philosophy, phenomenology were often marginalized as soft or secondary. The question, then, is not why didn't women become philosophers? It is why did philosophy decide who counts as a philosopher? This matters because philosophy shapes how societies define truth and authority. When entire perspectives are excluded, what appears universal is often partial. The canon becomes less a map of human thought and more a record of who was allowed to speak. Recovering women philosophers is not about diversity quotas or historical guilt. It is about epistemic honesty. A tradition that claims to study truth cannot ignore the conditions under which truth was filtered. The absence of women in philosophy is not evidence of intellectual inferiority. It is evidence of structural power. And power, when unexamined, always rewrites history in its own image. To ask why women philosophers are missing is to expose philosophy's blind spot, its failure to reflect on itself. If philosophy is truly the love of wisdom, it must confront the fact that wisdom was often silenced not because it was wrong, but because it spoke from the wrong body. This series exists to challenge that silence, not by rewriting history ideologically, but by reopening it philosophically, because the most philosophical question may not be what is truth, But who was never allowed to ask? This video is part of a broader project questioning the foundations of philosophy itself. If you value deep, critical analysis beyond names and timelines, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps keep long-form intellectual content alive. And let me leave you with a question. Share your thoughts in the comments. If philosophy claims universality, can it afford a history built on exclusion?